The storm came out of nowhere. One moment, the ocean was calm, the boat gliding smoothly over gentle waves. The next, black clouds swallowed the sky, and the wind howled like a wild beast. Rain lashed against the deck, and towering waves crashed against the hull, each one stronger than the last. "Hold on!" someone shouted, their voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. Mark gripped the railing with numb fingers, his heart pounding. The boat was losing the fight. A massive wave slammed into the side, sending him sprawling onto the deck. His vision blurred as water engulfed him, his body tossed like a rag doll. Then, a deafening crack. The boat split apart. Mark barely had time to react before he was yanked into the churning sea. Cold, crushing darkness surrounded him. He fought to stay afloat, gasping for air between waves. Lightning flashed above, illuminating pieces of wreckage scattered across the water. He reached for a floating plank, clinging to it with every ounce of strength he had left. His arms ached, his lungs burned, but he refused to let go. Hours seemed to pass, the storm finally easing, leaving only the rhythmic push and pull of the waves. Exhausted and barely conscious, Mark felt his body drifting. Then, sand. His fingers dug weakly into it. His body, battered and shaking, collapsed onto the shore. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know if anyone else had survived. All he knew was that he was alive, and that was only the beginning. The first thing Mark felt was pain. A dull, aching throb pulsed through his body, his limbs heavy, as if they weren't his own. His mouth was dry, his throat raw from swallowing seawater. His mind fought to wake up, but exhaustion clung to him like a weight. Then, a wave washed over his legs. Cold water rushed against his skin, jolting him fully awake. Sand. His fingers curled into it, coarse and damp. He forced his eyes open, squinting against the blinding sunlight. The storm was gone, replaced by an eerily calm sky. The ocean stretched endlessly behind him, deceptively peaceful, as if it hadn't tried to kill him just hours before. Mark groaned and rolled onto his side, coughing violently. His ribs screamed in protest. He was alive, but barely. Assessing the situation. Forcing himself to sit up, he took in his surroundings. An island. Lush green jungle loomed beyond the beach, thick with towering palm trees and tangled vines. The shoreline curved in both directions, but there were no signs of civilization, no boats, no wreckage, no people. "Hello?" His voice cracked, barely louder than a whisper. He tried again, shouting this time. No answer. A sinking feeling settled in his gut. Was he the only survivor? He glanced down at himself. His clothes were soaked and torn, his arms covered in bruises and scrapes. He had nothing, no food, no water, no supplies, just the tattered remains of what was once a normal life. But he couldn't afford to sit here. If he wanted to survive, he had to move. Water, the first priority. Mark knew one thing. Water was everything. Without it, he wouldn't last long. Pushing himself to his feet, he staggered forward, his legs weak and unsteady. Every step was a battle. The jungle loomed ahead, dark and dense. It wasn't inviting, but it was his best bet. If there was fresh water anywhere, it would be in there. He forced himself forward, stepping past the first line of trees. Instantly, the air changed. The thick canopy above swallowed the harsh sunlight, casting the jungle in cool shadows. The scent of damp earth and rotting leaves filled his nose. It was alive with sound, chirping insects, rustling branches, distant calls of unseen creatures. Every crackle and movement sent a shiver down his spine. He wasn't alone here. Mark pressed on, scanning the ground for any sign of water. His breath was heavy, his body drenched in sweat. Then, hope. A faint, trickling sound. His heart leaped. He followed the noise, pushing past thick foliage until a small stream appeared before him. Relief flooded through him. He collapsed onto his knees, scooping the cool water into his hands. It tasted like life itself. Shelter and fire water was a start, but Mark knew the next step. Shelter. The night would bring new dangers, and he couldn't afford to be exposed. He searched the area, looking for anything that could serve as a natural barrier. Eventually, He found a fallen tree near a cluster of large rocks, forming a small cove. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. Using palm fronds and branches, he reinforced the space, crafting something resembling a lean-to. It wasn't home, but it would keep him safe. But there was still one problem: fire. He needed warmth, protection, a signal, just in case someone was looking for him. Mark gathered dry leaves and sticks, stacking them into a small pile. He had no lighter, no matches, just his hands and his will. He worked tirelessly, rubbing a piece of wood against another, trying to create friction. Minutes passed, then an hour. His hands blistered, his muscles burned, but he refused to stop. Then, a spark. A tiny ember glowed in the dry leaves. Mark held his breath and blew gently. Flames erupted. For the first time since waking up on this island, he felt something close to victory. As the fire crackled, casting flickering light against the jungle, he leaned back against the tree and exhaled. He had water, he had shelter, he had fire, he had a chance. But deep inside, he knew the real fight was just beginning. Days passed, each one a battle against the island's relentless challenges. Mark had found a rhythm, but survival wasn't getting any easier. His food was limited, scavenging the jungle for edible fruits and the occasional fish he caught in the stream. His body still felt weak, his mind strained by the loneliness and uncertainty of his situation. It was on the third day, as Mark was resting beside his fire, that he saw something moving in the bushes. At first he froze, eyes narrowing. Was it another wild animal, maybe a predator? Or just a shadow of his mind playing tricks on him? But then, a small, scruffy dog emerged from the foliage. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The dog wasn't wild. Its fur was dirty but looked well fed, as if it had been surviving here for some time. The dog's eyes locked onto his with a mixture of curiosity and caution, but it didn't move away. "Hey there, little one," Mark murmured, instinctively reaching out. The dog took a cautious step forward, sniffing the air, but it didn't come any closer. Mark understood. Trust was earned, not given. For the next few days the dog stayed nearby but never approached. It seemed to be watching him, observing his every move. Mark left out some of his food, small bits of fish and fruit, and each day he found it gone. Slowly, he started to leave out more, and over time, the dog began to venture closer. A new companion. One morning, as Mark was cleaning fish by the stream, the dog appeared at his side, just a few feet away. Mark didn't move, his hands still. The dog looked up at him, a flicker of trust in its eyes. Slowly, cautiously, it stepped forward and sniffed the fish in Mark's hands. Mark held his breath. Without warning, the dog nosed the fish, then took it gently from his fingers. The contact sent a small thrill through Mark, and he smiled, the first real smile since arriving on the island. The dog looked at him as if to say, "I trust you now." Mark chuckled softly, wiping his hands on his pants. "Guess we're in this together now." From that day on, the dog became his constant companion. It followed him as he foraged for food, helping him find hidden berries or alerting him to fish swimming by the stream. It was as if the dog could sense when Mark needed help, and it always seemed to be there when he was at his lowest. One day, when Mark had wandered further into the jungle than usual, the dog stopped him. It barked sharply, then bolted off into the dense brush. "Hey, what is it?" Mark called, his voice laced with concern. The dog didn't turn back, but it didn't go far. It was as if the animal wanted Mark to follow, and he did. After a few minutes of weaving through the trees, Mark caught up with the dog. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The dog had found a hidden grove, and in the center was a small freshwater spring, its crystal-clear waters flowing from a rock formation. "Water," Mark whispered, staring at it in disbelief. The river he had been using had been running low, and now, this. Fresh, cool, life-giving water, as if the island itself had provided a gift. The dog looked up at him, its amber eyes full of quiet pride. This was its gift. Mark knelt down, cupping the water in his hands and drinking deeply. He felt it rushing through him, quenching his thirst in a way he hadn't thought possible. He was going to make it. The dog stayed by his side, sitting patiently as Mark drank. For the first time, Mark felt a deep sense of connection to the island, to the dog, and to life itself. A moment of peace. That evening, after returning to his shelter, Mark made a fire and sat down on the sand, the dog curled up beside him. He felt his exhaustion begin to melt away, the weight of his loneliness easing with each passing hour. The fire crackled, its warmth comforting, and the jungle whispered softly around him. For the first time in a long while, Mark wasn't alone. He had found an unexpected ally in the wild, a companion that understood the island's ways in a way he never could. The dog had shown him that survival wasn't just about finding food or water. It was about connection. As the fire burned low and the stars appeared overhead, Mark leaned back against a rock, looking up at the night sky. For the first time since the storm, he felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't going to die here. Not today. And he wasn't going to do it alone. Weeks passed on the island, the bond between Mark and the dog growing stronger each day. Mark had adapted to his life on the island, no longer solely focusing on survival, but learning to live. His body had healed, the strength slowly returning. The dog remained by his side, a constant presence in his daily life. It was as if the island had woven them into its fabric, and they had become a part of its rhythm. However, despite the familiarity of the routine, a gnawing sense of urgency had been growing in Mark, the desire to leave, the thought of returning to the world he had once known, even if it felt distant and unreachable, was always in the back of his mind. He couldn't stay on the island forever, no matter how connected he felt. The possibility of rescue was becoming more real as he noticed the movement of ships on the horizon during the early mornings. He had to find a way off. A chance at escape one morning, as Mark surveyed the beach for any signs of passing ships, his heart skipped a beat. In the distance, he saw a boat, not large enough to be a commercial vessel, but clearly a small fishing boat, drifting along the coastline. It was his chance. Mark's pulse quickened. He had seen boats before, but this one was closer than any he had noticed in the past. He sprinted down to the shoreline, adrenaline propelling his every step, his eyes locked on the approaching boat. Hope surged through him, but fear lingered too. Would they see him? Would they even stop? The dog, sensing the shift in Mark's emotions, was at his side in an instant. The two of them stood there, staring at the boat, waiting. The rescue. As the boat neared, Mark waved his arms frantically, shouting at the top of his lungs, his voice hoarse but filled with desperation. He could see the fishermen looking at him, and after what felt like an eternity, one of them raised a hand in acknowledgement. The boat slowed down, and before Mark knew it, a rope was tossed toward him. His heart pounded as he scrambled to grab it, pulling himself onto the boat. The fishermen helped him aboard, their faces a mix of surprise and concern. "We thought we lost you out here," one of the men said. Mark could hardly breathe as he slumped down onto the boat's floor, overcome with exhaustion, relief, and disbelief. It had happened. He was being rescued. He was going home. But then, in the distance, Mark saw the island fading into the horizon. The small green dot in the distance, once his prison, now felt like a strange, bittersweet home. And standing at the edge of the boat was the dog. The farewell. The dog had followed Mark to the water's edge, but it didn't come any closer. It sat there on the sand, watching the boat pull away. Mark's heart sank. "Come on," one of the fishermen urged. "Let it go. You're safe now. It's time to leave." Mark swallowed hard. His gaze stayed locked on the dog. It had saved him. It had been there when he was on the edge of death, guiding him, protecting him, and offering him companionship in his darkest hours. The dog had been his guardian, a wild creature who had given him hope when everything seemed lost. "Goodbye," Mark whispered, though he knew the dog couldn't hear him. The boat grew farther from the shore, and the dog finally stood up, watching Mark leave, as if it understood that its role had been completed. It turned around and disappeared into the jungle, back to its unknown life on the island. Mark leaned back, his eyes filling with unshed tears, his chest tight with emotion. The island had been his prison, but it had also been his savior, and the dog had been the bridge that had saved him. He had escaped the island, but the memory of the animal and the way it had changed his life would stay with him forever. As the boat sped toward the horizon, Mark took one last glance back at the island, his island. He had survived. He had made it out. But in his heart, he would always carry the lesson of the wild dog who had given him everything without asking for anything in return. And somewhere deep down, he knew he would never forget the island or the loyal companion who had helped him survive.